So the inflammasome has been linked to the same chronic diseases I showed you on the second slide. So this is kind of the connection. This is the how of how does inflammation impact all these things that you're seeing in your practice. A person that has chronic back pain, but they also have type 2 diabetes. Why are they not responding to the treatments that you're giving them? People that are overweight, people that have autoimmune disease. Autoimmune disease is growing exponentially right now, and this is one of the mechanisms. So what are the clinical applications of this? Well, first of all, back to the first few slides I showed, using high doses and consistent doses of things like ibuprofen and Advil and NSAIDs actually inhibit a necessary initiation phase for inflammation. They also block the formation of cartilage. I just explained to you why, because they stop the healing process. So yes, they decrease pain, but it's a short-term gain for long-term loss. Second thing is the composition of your cellular membrane is very important. And really, the composition of your cellular membrane is the sum of the fats that you're eating. Okay? Thirdly, the nervous system controls inflammation. So if you have a patient that is always chronically stressed, they are going to have a poor initiation and a resolution of inflammation. Because it's not just about what's going on at the level of the cellular membrane, it's what's going on with your sympathetic nervous system. So don't discount the effects of things like counseling, psychology, guided imagery, meditation, prayer. These are all evidence-based ways of addressing one of the root causes of inflammation. And unfortunately, they're way beyond going into them way beyond the scope of this course. Lymphatic drainage, already mentioned, and finally mitochondria. At some point, we're going to do a lecture, and we're going to do a presentation probably focused just on the mitochondria. But I want to start giving you snippets of how important this organelle, this little part in our cells, is for your health. So bringing it back to why we're here, how does everything that I just shared with you connect to the way that you're eating? And so that's kind of the next logical step that I want to take you on. Can I influence healing in my patients by the way we eat? And we're going to explore that, and I'm going to tell you, yes, we can. And so the simplest way to explain, as we'll go through, is you got to cut out the bad and put in the good. So first of all, we have to understand, so that was theoretical inflammation. We needed to have that foundation. The next step is dietary causes of inflammation. We need to find out what these foods are. Because if I'm trying to clean, I always use this analogy with my patient. If I want to have good health is a clean, fresh spring water, bucket full of spring water. If I want to clean that water, it's mucky and dirty right now. I need to stop pouring dirty water in. But I also need to pour clean water in at the same time. And finally, I need to filter the water. What we're going to talk about today is going to be stopping the flow of bad water in. So we want a nice, pristine bucket. And that's the analogy that I share with my patients often. And they understand that. There's been a few changes that have happened to the human race over the last few hundred years that humanity hasn't been exposed to for thousands of years before. Food, physical activity, sleep, exposure to toxins, stress is huge. Toxins, xenohormones, so molecules that are acting like external hormones. The influence of each one of these things, unfortunately, is very powerful, and we don't have time to get into all of them, but we're going to focus on the first one, diet. The impact that each one of these things has on your body, hormonally, digestively, immune, nutrient, mitochondrial, is what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. Anybody know what hasn't changed? So these are all the things that have changed, let's say, in the last 200 years. What hasn't changed that's not on this list? And it's a pretty big staple, and it hasn't changed for 100,000 years, or so researchers think. Anybody have an idea? What hasn't changed on this list? Sorry? Your genetics, that's right, your DNA. So scientists think that all these things have been rapidly changing in the last 200-300 years, and maybe even further back, but our genes really haven't. They haven't really changed in the last 100,000 years. So we may be living in an environment that our genetic code was never developed for, or never evolved in this environment. So that's something important to remember, because there's a lot of this talk about this idea of being more paleo diet. We're going to explore that at length. So I'm not going to get into it now, but there is tons of research now being looked at. How did we eat before, and how should we be eating now, based on the evolution where our genes actually were developing. This is a great paper by the guy who developed the paleo diet, Dr. Cordain. He's a PhD, and he came up with 6 major ways that our diets changed from our ancestors. Glycemic load, so the amount of sugar, how quickly it gets dumped into our body. Fat, the quality of fat has changed. Carbs, proteins, and fats have changed. Nutrients, deficiencies. Acid-base balance, and we're going to get into this a bit more detail. And finally, fiber content. Okay? This is also a good little paper that a chiropractor actually wrote from Florida, just basically outlining your diet has a huge impact on your inflammatory state. So again, I won't get into the details, but we now can't deny that our diet induces inflammation. And so this is kind of what I want to share. Number 1, specific foods that induce inflammation. Refined animal fats and saturated fats promote inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance. We all know about inflammation. I want you to remember this term, insulin resistance. I'm going to come back to it. There's a number of studies that have shown this and confirmed this. One of my favorites that I always talk about in my lectures is the Egg McMuffin study. And basically, they gave participants an bacon, egg sandwich, breakfast sandwich in the morning, and then they measured their NF-kappa B levels. Remember that chronic, very strong inflammatory signaling molecule? And they found that it went up in just 2 hours after just one of these. It went up 150% without changing any injury or anything else like that. So this is strongly related, they said, to the saturated fats, the damaged fats that are in a food like this. Okay? What about sugar? Especially refined sugar. Also been linked strongly to not only impairing the immune system, which it does, which we've all experienced in our lives before. Halloween, kids get really, really ADD, and then they probably get some sort of flu. Sore throat is one of the first things that starts happening, where you have a high amount of sugar, it suppresses your immune system, and infection starts taking over. So sugars themselves, actually what they do when they hang out in the body, they actually start grabbing proteins, changing their shape, and not allowing them to work. Proteins are like the building blocks and the keys through our whole body. They're the things that happen, that enzyme systems, they're all proteins. So when proteins start getting damaged, what's called cross-linking, the main reason the function stops, but the main reason they get damaged is because sugar starts glycating with them or damaging them. And then finally, some specific grains and omega-6s, gluten, which I'll talk about on its own in a second, they actually produce inflammation in their own right. Okay? I'm a big visual guy, if you haven't noticed, so I like different visual graphs and things. Again, remember I said 200 years or so, 150 years? Really, the rates of diabetes and sugar consumption has been really, really low in the 1800s. And then as sugar consumption started getting up and it started getting very cheap to use this stuff, and not to mention the advent of high fructose corn syrup, which we'll talk about, you can see that there's a very strong correlation with sugar consumption and diabetes rates. And diabetes is really what I like to call the mother of all other diseases. It's been linked to Alzheimer's, cancer, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease. Just a quick note, I want to kind of take you back to Biochem 101, just so we understand. When a patient says, I can't lose weight, you know, I thought I was supposed to just avoid all fats. It's more than that. And I'll explain this to you really, really quickly. This is what happens when you have a normal cell that's producing energy. We've all seen this. When you have enough oxygen, like all you right here, you are burning, using the mitochondria, an oxidative respiration, and you're producing 32 ATP. If you went out and started getting you to run around the quad in the back or up and down stairs, you're going to be using a different energy system and you're going to be making a lot less ATP. But what about, so this is a healthy producing system. So you have energy, glucose, you make energy. Now what about excess? When you have way more sugar, way more calories than you need, this is what happens. Number one is that the body actually has a feedback mechanism saying, I'm good, I don't need to produce any more energy. So it actually feeds back to a key enzyme called PFK, or phosphofructokinase. This enzyme actually, when it's blocked, it actually says, you know what, glucose, I don't want you into the cell. Stay outside. So this is the bloodstream out here. So now the glucose is in the bloodstream. Remember what I said about protein cross-linking? The last place the body wants glucose is in the bloodstream because it is very, very damaging to our endothelial lining, our lining of our blood vessels. So what does the body do? It starts storing it as glycogen. It stores it in muscle and it stores it in liver. So this is, evolutionarily, this has happened for thousands of years. This is a good thing, right? So in a sense, they just killed this big wildebeest and you want to have a big feast and you want to store that. You don't want to waste that energy because otherwise our ancestors would have died. Because if they're required glucose every few minutes and they have no storage, we're screwed. So here, we actually have storage in our muscles and in our liver. But what about after we reach that threshold, about 170 grams for an average weighted person, what happens then? So now, all the storage, the primary storage area is filled up. So now there's glucose still in the system. It's still being poured in because the person just had another Slurpee. Now, it can't go here, it can't go here, it goes to the third place, which is fat. So once it gets to the PFK sends it away and it starts forming triglycerides. This is how sugar gets converted to fat. And this is why sugar is a huge driver of obesity, actually much more powerfully than fat. This excess fat, this excess adipose tissue, this is actually a big problem. And I'm going to tell you why in a second, because it is a huge reserve for, it's basically an organ that produces inflammation and produces hormonal imbalance. The other thing that starts happening is that when there's a ton of glucose hanging around here and there's extra fat, insulin resistance starts happening. So that's where the door becomes shut. The cells stop accepting insulin. This is the standard thing that happens in type 2 diabetes. So food companies got smart, or dumb for that matter, for our health, because we started introducing things like high fructose corn syrup to our diet. High fructose corn syrup bypasses everything I just talked to you. It has no bearing on insulin receptors. It gets absorbed quickly into the body, and in this environment, it gets converted directly to fat. So it does not have any of these kind of natural mechanisms in place to regulate it. And finally, when you have a ton of this fat, which most of North America is exposed to, you start having what's called meta-inflammation. We've all heard of a meta-analysis, right? So this is kind of a broad, wide-ranging, global inflammation. Think of this as global, universal inflammation. So when a person is overweight, they have meta-inflammation. So remember I asked you to remember